There are people in this world who choose to disappear, not because they are lost, but because they believe the people who love them are better off not finding them. And then there are children who grow up with nothing but a photograph and a 30-year hunger to understand why they were let go. If you have ever loved someone and had to make an impossible choice, or if you have ever been the one left behind, this story is going to reach inside you and find something you thought you had buried a long time ago. By the end of what you are about to hear, you will understand why a woman kept a small envelope of photographs hidden at the back of her dresser drawer for nearly 3 decades. You will understand why she took them out every year on the same day, alone, without telling anyone. And you will understand why the moment she finally did not need them anymore made her weep harder than the day she gave her children away. There are 2 stories woven into this one. They begin in the same place and travel so far from each other that most people would have stopped looking. Most people would have accepted the distance as permanent. But permanence is a word that love does not always agree to honor. The first story belongs to a man the world might call a wanderer. His name is Thomas. He is in his early 60s now, and if you had passed him on the road outside a small mountain town, you might have noticed only his worn boots, the way he walked slowly as though he was listening to something beneath his feet, and the color of his eyes, a blue-gray that sits between the sky before rain and the sky after, a color that belongs to no single country and yet is unmistakably of everywhere at once. That color comes from a father he never knew. A man who was a military doctor, stationed far from home during a war that divided a country, who loved a young woman briefly and then vanished, the way men sometimes do when wars end and planes take them home before consequences can follow. Thomas was born into the space that absence leaves behind. His mother was young, overwhelmed, and caught between 2 lives, the one she had before him and the one she was trying to build without him. She placed him in the care of others when he was still too small to form a memory of her face. He did not hold on to bitterness about that for a long time, or perhaps it is more accurate to say that the bitterness was so complete, so total, that it became something else over time, a kind of philosophy, a way of moving through the world that required no one. He grew up in a series of orphanages. When he was about 11 years old, he left, not dramatically, not with a plan. He simply walked away one afternoon and kept walking. The world outside the gates was harder than anything he had faced inside, and yet it felt more honest to him. He ate what he could find. He slept in places that were not meant for sleeping. He discovered very young that he was drawn to high places, to hillsides and cliffs, and the long slopes of mountains where the air thinned and the noise of people below became a distant rumor. By 12, he had found that he could survive on very little. Wild berries, river water, the occasional kindness of strangers who asked nothing in return. He told himself this was freedom, and for a long time he believed it. What he was actually doing, and this is something he would only admit to himself much later, in the private language of a man who has spent decades learning to listen to his own silences, was protecting everyone he might have loved from the weight of loving him back. He believed, in a way so deep it had become structural, that he was someone who caused abandonment simply by existing. First his father had left, then his mother had given him away. If you are a child and 2 people who made you cannot bear to stay near you, then perhaps the kindest thing you can do for the rest of the world is to keep walking. So he walked. For decades, he walked. He crossed mountain ranges. He slept in forests so thick the stars disappeared. He reached the northern edges of the country in winter and slept with plastic bags wrapped around his feet against the cold. He reached a border market town in the deep north, where a woman from a hill tribe gave him a blanket without being asked, and he slept on the concrete floor of a covered market until the vendors came at dawn and woke him gently. As though he were simply a man resting, rather than a man with nowhere to be. He collected none of this as hardship. He collected it as evidence that the world was fundamentally decent, even when it was brutal. He had no bitterness toward mountains or rivers. He had no complaint against the rain. He wrote poetry sometimes, in a small notebook he kept wrapped in a piece of oilcloth tucked inside his shirt, The poems were about light, about the particular quality of silence at high elevation, about the way a valley looks when mist comes off the river at first light, and the world disappears briefly into something that is neither visible nor invisible, but exists in the space between. He was never entirely alone. He simply refused to be found. Eventually, he settled into a kind of slow orbit around a mountain pass, a long, dramatic stretch of road that arcs along the spine of a coastal range, where the sea is visible from the heights on clear days and the clouds come in below you during storms, so that you stand above the weather looking down at it. He gathered discarded bottles and cans and sold them to a small shop at the base of the pass for enough money to buy rice and occasionally fruit. He built a shelter from old tarps on the steep side of the hill, held up by rope tied to trees, close enough to a trickle of mountain spring water to drink from it, and far enough from the road that no one came looking. A young man with a camera found him first. He had driven the pass many times and noticed Thomas, noticed the slow, deliberate way he moved, noticed that the same man seemed to have made this remote stretch of road his home. He pulled over one afternoon and walked toward Thomas with the careful, open body language of someone who has learned that wary people need space before words. He told Thomas he had seen him a few times. He asked how he was. Thomas studied the young man for a long moment. He had learned to read people very quickly, learned it the way all people learn survival skills, from necessity and repetition. He saw something in this young man's face that he recognized, genuine curiosity without agenda. This was rare, he answered in short sentences. He said he was fine. He said the mountains suited him. He said the pass was good country. The young man asked if he could bring him something sometime. A few changes of clothes, perhaps. Thomas hesitated. Then he said that would be acceptable. Over the following weeks, the young man, whose name was Callum, came back several times. He brought a camera and began to document Thomas's daily life with a restraint and respect that Thomas noticed and appreciated. Callum did not press for information. He let the camera catch what it caught, the slow, practiced way Thomas sorted through his collected bottles, the way he sat on a flat boulder above the pass in the late afternoon, looking out toward the horizon, the poems he would sometimes read aloud in a quiet voice when he thought the camera was aimed somewhere else. When the first small video appeared online, the response surprised Callum. People watched, not in large numbers at first, but the people who watched deeply. They shared it quietly, the way people share things that feel almost private, almost too tender to expose to large light. They said things in the comments like, "This man deserves better," and "Something about him reminds me of my own father," and "I watched this 3 times and I cried each time and I don't fully understand why." It was after the second video that something shifted. People began to send small amounts of money through Callum's channel. Others sent messages asking where Thomas was, whether he was safe, whether anything could be done to help. A restaurant owner, whose property sat at the crest of the pass, told Callum he had been watching the videos and that he was willing to offer a small room at the back of his building. Nothing much, just 4 walls and a roof and a lock on the door, but a real room, with shelter from the rains. Callum was preparing to bring this news to Thomas when he arrived at the pass one morning and found that Thomas was gone. Not gone in the way of a man who has fled. Gone in a way that was familiar to those who knew him, quietly, suddenly, as though the mountain had simply absorbed him back into its silence. What Callum did not know, and would not discover until later, was that a woman named Margaret had driven up the pass road that same morning. She had seen the videos from her hospital waiting room, 3 towns away, where she had been sitting with her mother during a long medical appointment. She had recognized Thomas immediately, not from any video, not from any news, but from a memory 7 years old, from a road, from the particular way he walked, from the color of his eyes that sat between 2 kinds of sky. She had left the hospital, driven to the pass, and asked a woman at the roadside tea stand where the man with the bottles usually collected his cans. She had found him within an hour. Thomas had not recognized her at first. And then he had, and something in his face had shifted very briefly, in a way that Callum would later say he wished he had been there to see. Not happiness exactly, not surprise, something more complicated. The expression of a man who has spent his entire life believing the universe does not keep track of him, discovering that he was wrong. Marguerite told him she was taking him home. He said he was fine where he was. She said she would stay and collect bottles with him if he preferred. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said that would not be necessary. She had him in the car and moving before he remembered that he had left his notebook behind. The one wrapped in oilcloth, the one with 30 years of poems written in the margins, and across the blank pages in handwriting that had grown smaller and more precise with each passing year, the way a man's script does when he has learned to take up as little space as possible. He told Marguerite this from the passenger seat, very quietly. She pulled over immediately and called Callum. But what Thomas did not know, what he would only discover once he was seated in Marguerite's home, looking out at the river that ran along the edge of her family's land, listening to the particular kind of quiet that comes when someone has decided to be responsible for your well-being, was that someone, somewhere, had watched those videos and recognized not just Thomas, but the story behind Thomas, and that a message had already been sent, carefully and uncertainly, that would change the shape of everything he thought he knew about being alone. And that message had come from someone who had spent 27 years asking a completely different kind of question in a completely different part of the world. Someone who had never stopped looking, not once, not for a single year. Marguerite's property sat at the edge of a low hill where the land flattened out into a wide basin, crossed by a river, so clear you could see the stones on the bottom from 20 feet above the bank. Thomas had been there 3 days before he stopped watching the door. Not because he was afraid. He had stopped being afraid of people a long time ago, in the way that a man who has slept through enough storms eventually stops flinching at thunder. He watched the door because leaving through it was a reflex as old as memory, and some part of him was still deciding whether to honor that reflex or to let it rest. Marguerite seemed to understand this without being told. She did not ask him questions about his past. She did not introduce him to visitors with an explanation attached to his name. She simply moved around him, the way you move around something that has been through weather, carefully, without sudden gestures, leaving him room to take up whatever amount of space felt safe. Her husband, a quiet man named Desmond, who communicated mostly through the practical language of doing useful things, had built Thomas a low wooden bench beside the garden where he could sit in the mornings with his coffee and look up at the hill without anyone looking back at him. It was the kind of thoughtfulness that does not announce itself, and Thomas noticed it with the sharp attention of a man who has had very little of it in his life. The family's farm spread behind the house, rows of herbs and medicinal plants, a small orchard, a handful of animals that moved through the paddock in their slow, purposeful ways. Thomas began, without being asked, to walk the edges of the property in the early mornings. He identified plants he recognized from years of mountain living. Roots good for inflammation, a leaf that brewed into something useful for joint pain. When he discovered that Marguerite suffered from a chronic ache in her lower back, he spent 2 days on the hillside behind the property and came back with a collection of roots and bark that he boiled down into a deep amber liquid and left on her kitchen counter, without explanation. She drank it. Her back felt better within a week. She told him so, and he nodded and said nothing else about it, and that was the whole conversation, and it was somehow complete. Callum came to visit during the second week and brought with him the oilcloth notebook, which he and a second friend had spent an entire afternoon retrieving from Thomas's shelter on the pass, climbing the unmarked path through sharp grass and loose stone to reach the makeshift tarp structure that clung to the hillside like a thought someone had not quite finished. When Callum placed the notebook in Thomas's hands, Thomas held it for a moment without opening it. Then he set it on the bench beside him. Later that evening, Marguerite saw the light on in Thomas's room long after midnight. She did not knock. It was around this time that Callum showed Thomas a comment that had appeared beneath one of the videos. He had been hesitant to share it, had sat with it for several days, reading it over, considering whether it would bring Thomas comfort or open something that was better left closed. In the end, he decided that the choice belonged to Thomas, not to him. The comment was long and carefully written by someone who identified themselves only as a friend of a woman named Clara, a woman who, the commenter said, had emigrated decades ago and built a life far away, who had 3 children by 3 different paths, and carried the weight of decisions made in desperate years the way some people carry old injuries, quietly and only noticeably in cold weather. The commenter said she had watched the video with Clara, that Clara had gone very still during certain parts, that afterward Clara had said nothing for almost 20 minutes, and then she had said, "That could be my son." Thomas read the comment twice. He set his phone face down on the bench beside the notebook. He looked out at the river for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and read it a 3rd time. Callum asked him what he was thinking. Thomas said, "I am thinking about what it costs a person to say something like that out loud." He did not say anything else for the rest of the afternoon. This was the shape of Thomas's grief, not anger, not the hot demanding kind of hurt that wants acknowledgement and apology. It was something more like a long, cool distance. He had built his life around the fact of his abandonment by making the abandonment irrelevant. He had decided at some age too young for the decision to be fair, that he did not need the people who had failed to keep him. He had organized his entire interior world around that decision, his wandering, his mountain passes, his poetry in small handwriting, his refusal to be cared for. All of it was architecture, built on that foundation, and now the foundation was being examined. He told Callum, "I do not want to disrupt anyone's life." Callum said, "You might not be the only one who gets to decide that." Thomas looked at him. This was perhaps the most direct anyone had been with him in years, and for a moment, something in his face flickered, the expression of a man who has been handed an argument he cannot immediately defeat. He said nothing, but he did not look away. 2 days later, Callum received a message from a woman in another country. Her name was Gabrielle. She was in her late 20s. Her written English was careful and formal in the way of someone who had grown up speaking multiple languages and had learned to be precise in all of them. She said she had found the videos through a long circuitous path, a reshare, then another reshare, then a comment that mentioned the man's unusual eyes, the color between 2 kinds of sky. She said she was writing because she had spent the last 10 years looking for someone who matched a description she had been given when she was 18 years old. On the day her adoptive parents sat her down and gave her a folder of documents and photographs, and told her that she was loved by more people than she perhaps knew. She said she had been born in the country shown in the videos, that she and a twin sister had been placed for adoption as infants by a mother who had made the decision during a period of profound hardship, that the adoption had taken them both to a family in another country, a warm, devoted family who had never hidden the truth from them, who had taken them back to their birth country multiple times, searching for answers, who had given them every resource they could find to trace their origins. She said she had come close before. She had spent 3 weeks in the coastal region only months ago, staying in a small resort town, searching, and, on the final day before her return flight, she had walked into a local government office with a folder of 27-year-old documents and sat across from a clerk who had given her 2 hours of careful attention. 2 hours later, she had a name, and an address, and a phone number. She said the reunion had happened in a parking lot outside a municipal building. She said her mother had stepped out of a car and crossed the distance between them at a pace that was almost running. She said her mother's face had been the face of someone returning from a very long trip to a place that had never stopped being home. She said the 2 of them had held each other in the bright afternoon light without speaking, and that the silence had lasted long enough for the whole parking lot to go quiet around them, and that when she finally heard her mother's voice, broken, grateful, asking nothing, offering everything, she had understood something about the word forgiveness that she had not understood before. Not forgiveness as an act, not forgiveness as a decision made and recorded. Forgiveness as a thing that was already finished before it was even asked for, as something that had been waiting inside her all along, patient as water, needing only the right moment to become visible. And then she paused in her message and she said, "I am telling you this because I believe the man in your video is someone connected to my mother's story. I am telling you this because I believe you deserve to know that there is someone on the other side of the ocean who has spent 30 years being sorry and who is still alive and who is no longer hard to find." Callum stared at the message for a long time. He read it to Thomas that evening, sitting on the wooden bench beside the garden while the last light came off the river in slow gold sheets. Thomas did not move while Callum read. He sat very still in the way he had always sat still. Not rigid, not tense, but with the particular stillness of a man who has learned to let things pass through him without reaction. When Callum finished reading, Thomas looked at the hill for a while. He said, very quietly, "She found her mother." Callum said, "Yes," Thomas said, "and her mother was looking for her." Callum said yes, and he waited. Thomas picked up the oilcloth notebook from the bench beside him. He held it in both hands, not opening it, the way you hold something that belongs to a version of yourself. "You are not sure you can still reach," he said. "What do you want me to do with this information, Callum?" And Callum said, "I don't want you to do anything with it. I just didn't think I had the right to decide for you what you got to know." Thomas set the notebook down. He looked out at the river. The light had almost gone. Somewhere behind the house, one of Marguerite's chickens made a small sound and went quiet again. He said, "I told a man once that my mother had her happiness, and I would not go disturbing it. I believed that when I said it, I still believe some part of it." He paused. Then he said, "But a woman crossed an ocean and spent 3 weeks and walked into a government office on the last possible day, and she found her mother." Another pause. And then he said, "I wonder if she thought she was protecting anyone." Callum did not answer. He understood that this was not a question meant for him. The next morning, Thomas was still there. He was sitting on his bench when Marguerite came out at dawn with 2 cups of coffee, and he accepted the one she offered him, and they sat together without talking while the mist came off the river. He told her after a while that there was something he needed to think about. She nodded and said she would be here when he was done thinking. He looked at her and said, "You are a strange kind of person, Marguerite." She smiled and said she had been told that before. He said, "I mean it as a compliment." She said she knew. They sat until the mist cleared and the river came back into view, and the hill turned gold, and somewhere on the road above the farm a truck passed slowly, with its engine low and steady, climbing toward the pass where Thomas had spent so many years counting bottles against the sky. He thought about a woman who had carried photographs in a drawer for 27 years. He thought about a girl who had crossed an ocean on the last possible day. He thought about a parking lot and a silence that lasted long enough for the whole world to go quiet. He thought about what it means to stay. He opened the oilcloth notebook to a blank page near the back. He did not write anything yet. He simply held the pen above the paper for a long time, feeling the distance between the two. The pen and the page, the thought and the word. The man he had been, and the man who was possibly, carefully, beginning to consider whether there was something else he could still become. And then his phone, which was sitting on the bench beside him, made a sound, a soft chime, the kind that announces not a call but a message. And he looked at the screen, and the name on it was one he did not recognize, but the country code was one he knew. Thomas held the phone for a long time without opening the message. Marguerite had gone inside. The coffee cup sat empty on the bench between where she had been and where he still was. The river below the farm moved the same way it always moved, without hurry, without drama, finding the path of least resistance between stones it had been navigating for longer than anyone on its banks had been alive to watch. He set the phone face down on the bench. He picked up his pen. He looked at the blank page in the notebook. Then he turned the phone over and opened the message. It was written in 2 languages. The first half he could not read. The second half was in English, careful and unhurried, the kind of English that belongs to someone who has chosen every word the way you choose stones to cross a river, testing each one for steadiness before putting your weight on it. It said, My name is Gabrielle. I think you may know who I am by now, if Callum has spoken with you. I am not writing to ask anything of you. I am writing because I found my mother last month, and she is well, and she is kind, and she told me when I asked her that she has a son. She has never stopped thinking about. She did not ask me to write to you. This is my own decision, she said, only that she hoped wherever you were warm. I thought you should know that, she said that. Thomas read the message 3 times. The third time he read it very slowly, the way you read something when you are trying to understand, not just the words but the person behind them. The particular kind of courage it takes to reach across 27 years of silence and say, wherever you are, I hope you are warm. He did not write back immediately. He closed the phone and sat for another hour watching the river. At some point, Margaret came back out and saw his face and went back inside and came out again with a fresh cup of coffee that she set beside him without a word. She went back inside. She did not ask. He thought about a woman he barely remembered. What he remembered was not her face. He had never truly had her face, had only ever had the idea of it. Constructed from absence, the way you construct an image of something you have never seen by looking at the space where it is not. What he remembered was a feeling, the particular quality of being very small and unmoored, the sensation of the ground shifting beneath something that should have been permanent. He had turned that feeling into a philosophy. He had made a life out of the decision that he needed no ground to stand on because he was always moving. He had written poems about the sky and the mountain and the light on high ridges because those were things that required nothing of him and asked only that he be present to witness them. But here, now, on this bench beside this river, with this cup of coffee that someone had brought him without being asked, he felt something that the mountain had never given him. He felt the specific warmth of being known, not completely, not historically, but in this moment, in this place, by these people who had decided without drama that he was someone worth bringing coffee to. He thought about what Gabrielle had written. She hoped wherever you were warm. He looked down at his coffee. He thought, I am warm. He picked up the phone. He opened the message. He typed slowly because he was not practiced at this, at reaching toward rather than away, at choosing contact over distance, at being the one who moves toward rather than the one who moves on. He typed, My name is Thomas. I received your message. I am well. I am living for the time being with a family who have been very kind to me. I read what you wrote about your mother, and I have been sitting with it for some time. I do not know yet what I am able to say or do with this information. But I want you to know that I read your words carefully. All of them. He paused, his thumb hovered over the screen. Then he added one more line. He typed, Please tell her I am warm. He sent it before he could reconsider. Then he set the phone down and picked up his pen and wrote something in the notebook. One short line at the top of the blank page. The way you write a title before you know what the story will be. Callum came by that afternoon and found Thomas in the garden, hands dark with soil, planting something in a long row beside the medicinal herbs. He crouched down to look. Thomas had found a section of ground near the back fence and was setting in seedlings from small pots he had apparently assembled from cuttings taken on his morning walks along the hillside. Callum asked what he was planting. Thomas said, Something Marguerite can use for her back. It takes about 3 months to establish. You have to give it time, Callum said. So you are planning to be here in 3 months? Thomas did not look up. He pressed the soil down around a small stem with 2 fingers, firm and careful, the gesture of someone who has done this before. He said, Plants need tending. You cannot plant something and then leave it. Callum sat down in the grass beside him. He stayed there while Thomas worked his way down the row, pressing and patting, not rushing. The afternoon light came at an angle through the orchard and lay across the garden in long golden strips, and the whole scene was quiet in the way that only genuinely unhurried things can be quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness, but of sufficiency, the quiet of enough. After a while, Callum said, Did you write back to her? Thomas said yes, Callum said, and Thomas said, And I told her I was warm. Callum said nothing for a moment, then he said, That's a good thing to say. Thomas said, It is the truth. It seemed like the right place to start. They stayed there until the light shifted, and the shadows of the orchard trees stretched long across the grass. Inside the house, Margaret was cooking something that smelled of herbs and warmth, and Desmond was moving around, doing the quiet, practical things he always did, and the chickens were settling into their slow evening routines, and the river below the hill kept moving the way rivers do, carrying everything downstream, making room for whatever is coming next. Thomas finished the row of seedlings and sat back on his heels and looked at what he had done. A long, even line of small green things in dark earth, fragile and particular and alive. He wiped his hands on his trousers. He picked up the phone from where it sat in the grass beside him and looked at it once more. There was no reply yet. He did not expect one immediately. Some responses take time to compose. Some silences need to be honored before they can be broken. He put the phone in his pocket and stood up slowly, the way a man in his 60s stands after kneeling, with attention, with the slight adjustment of weight that comes from a body that remembers everything it has carried. He walked toward the house. At the kitchen door, he stopped. Through the screen, he could see Margaret at the stove, her back to him, and the warm interior light of the kitchen, and the table already set for the evening meal. 3 places, the same 3 places that had been set every evening since he arrived, without ceremony, without discussion, as though this had always been the arrangement. He stood there for a moment in the doorway, between outside and inside, between the cooling evening air and the warmth that came through the screen, between the man he had been on the mountain pass and the man who was standing here now with soil on his hands and a phone in his pocket that carried, somewhere inside it, the weight of a message to a woman he had never properly known. He thought about a parking lot, a woman stepping out of a car, a silence long enough for the world to go quiet. He thought about what it means to let yourself be found. He pushed open the screen door and went inside. Marguerite turned from the stove and looked at him. She took in the soil on his hands and his trousers, and something in her face settled into a quiet expression, but was warmer than one. She said, "Wash your hands. Dinner is almost ready." He went to the sink. He ran the water warm. He watched the dark soil lift from his skin and swirl down the drain and disappear. And he dried his hands on the small towel hanging beside the faucet, and he walked to the table and sat down in the chair that had, without anyone saying so, become his. On the table between the 3 place settings, there was a small glass jar. Inside it were 3 stems of something Marguerite must have cut from the hillside. Simple wildflowers, pale yellow, the kind of flower that appears along mountain paths in early spring when the cold has only barely finished. Thomas looked at them for a long moment. Then he reached out and straightened the jar a fraction, just enough so that the flowers faced the window. He left his hand on the table. He did not pull it back. And far away, in a country reached by ocean and time and the particular courage of a young woman who had walked into a government office on the last possible day, a mother was sitting in her own kitchen, looking at a photograph she had kept for 27 years in an envelope at the back of a drawer. She had not put it away yet. She was still looking at it when her phone lit up with a message from her daughter, and the message said only, "He wrote back. He says he is warm." She set down the photograph. She put both hands flat on the table. She closed her eyes. And outside Thomas's kitchen window, the river kept moving, and the seedlings stood in their row in the darkening garden, and somewhere on a mountain pass, the wind moved through an empty hillside where a tarp shelter had once stood, and the place where it had been was already becoming indistinguishable from everything around it. Just hillside, just grass, just the mountain doing what mountains do, which is to hold the shape of what has passed through them without holding on to it. Is there someone you have been meaning to reach out to? Someone you have been telling yourself is better off without hearing from you? And what has it cost you to keep that silence?